Have you ever felt like life is not fair? Hey, welcome to my channel, God's Plan Works. In this video, I will share three divine principles for your consideration as an answer to this question. But before I present these principles, um, please, if you would you hit or smash the subscribe button down below so that you can stay tuned for any new future videos that I shall post. And also be sure to give me a thumbs up um, if this content is of help to you, and this will help me in my plan for future videos. But the question that we want to entertain today is: have you ever felt like life is not fair? This question is not a new question. It's not a new feeling or concern. There's a person that will draw from antiquity by the name of David that left a record of his perplexity about this question. Is life fair or unfair? David recorded or wrote a song that's recorded in Psalms 73. And I encourage you, those of you Bible readers, if you've never read this psalm, and you will see that if you have these feelings, you're not alone. David responds to the question. He acknowledges he acknowledges the fact. He says that God is truly good. He says good to Israel, to such as are of a pure heart. So he opens up, letting us know he's a believer, but he knows in his mind, that God is good, and he's good to them who have a pure heart. But then he begins to state his personal position in reference to this question: have you ever felt life is unfair? He said, but as for me, my feet had almost stumbled. My steps, he said, had nearly slipped. In other words, David is sharing with us, I believe what's common to most human beings is you have them almost experiences. And I won't belabor the point of, and I'm sure each of us we can recall that time of I almost. In his case, he says, I almost stumbled. He says, I nearly slipped. Then he begins to reflect on the antecedents that led him to this moment and feeling. He says, I was envious of the wicked. You see this in verse 3. He says, I saw the prosperity of the wicked. And as he observed this and he acknowledges his feelings of envy in this, he notes his the perplexity of the situation that asked him or caused him to ask this very question: have you ever felt like life is unfair? He says they don't receive consequences for their evil doings. Everything that they do, it appears that there is no consequences. They seem to be living above the law. He says they're not troubled as other men, or perplexed like or plagued like other men. He says they wear pride, or pride serves as a necklace, or allow me in my own colloquialism to say, as a badge of honor. Violence covers them, he says, like a garment. He's stating to us what's causing him to ask this question, and states to us his feelings. He acknowledges, he says, they say, talking about the wicked, that he's observing, evildoers, those who don't have no consciousness of God. He says, they say, how does God know? And is there knowledge in the Most High? He says, I look and observe at them, and they appear to be, he says, always at ease. And then he lets us in on the results of him being perplexed about these concerns that he observed and he witnesses. He says, all day long I have been plagued. When I thought to understand, it was too painful. And then he begins, like most of us will do, he begins to compare their behavior with his acts of faith. He says, I have cleansed my heart in vain. I wash my hands in innocent. In other words, you allow me to translate what he just said in my own local colloquialism. He said, what's the point? I'm living this righteous thing. If I were to put it in today's vernacular, I pay tithes. I do right by the poor. I help. I try to treat everybody right. I try to live a life of integrity. And what's the point? I'm watching others appear not to have any concern about God, and yet they appear, he says, to be prospering. It is here that I want to give you 3 divine principles for your consideration. In other words, I'm going to tell you, when you feel like this, talk to God about it. Principle number 1, go to a place where God's presence is known to be. In other words, number 1, go to a place where God's presence is known to be. You want to get an answer to this. David said, he says, until I went into the sanctuary of God. For him, his place where the presence of God was the sanctuary. You see this in verse 17, the 8th portion of it, that verse. Your sanctuary doesn't have to be the 4 corners of a mosque or a temple or a church or a ministry building or place. Your sanctuary could be on the beach, could be walking in a park, it could be in your car, it could be like at my house, I have a tree, I call it my meditation tree. But it's a spot where you know where the presence of God is known. Number 2, principle 2, I want you to consider. Speak candidly when you enter into that place where God's presence is known to be. Speak candidly about what's in your heart to God. In other words, David said in verse 18, it says, he says, surely you're going to cast them in slippery places. God, surely you're going to cast them down into destruction. David speaking candidly about his feelings. Man, I can recall some dark places in my life where I was just up against a wall. I could not understand the treatment, or I could not understand behaviors of others. I went and talked to God about it. When I say candid, look, there is not one language there's not one word on the planet that God doesn't understand. You can't speak something you don't understand. I went to secret places out in the woods and just, man, I cussed at the trees. I yelled, I screamed, I shouted my heart before God and candidly spoke to him what I understood at the moment. But here's where principle number 3 is very important that I want you to consider. Listen quietly. When I say listen quietly, it means stop talking, and you can talk without your mouth moving, So you got to stop talking verbally, stop talking in your mind, your heart, your soul, and listen quietly for God's response or to his revelation about the matter. David said in the B portion of verse 17, for him, he says, then I understood therein. And in verse 22 of that Psalm 73, he says, but it is good for me to draw near to God. And so the final thoughts I want to leave for you as a takeaway, because when you use the principles I just laid out for you to go to that place where the presence of God, you know it to be, to speak candid when you're there, speak candidly to him from what's in your heart, and to listen, really listen for God's response to your concerns. Then there's when you receive this, like David, after he received his answer, because he went and talked to God about it. Afterwards, the first thing he has, and so if it happens to you, don't consider it to be abnormal. What happened to David, his first thing he felt ashamed. He felt ashamed of his prior attitude towards God, because he says in verse 20, he says, I was foolish and ignorant. And then not only did he feel ashamed, but he also felt renewed in his perspective of life. He says, until I went into the sanctuary. In other words, I had this glim, dreary, negative view, but when I went into that place where God dwells and I entered out, I came out with a renewed perspective of life. And then finally, David felt encouraged. Encouraged about what? Well, encouraged not to look at others, but rather stay focused on what God is doing. In other words, as I close, always talk to God about it. I hope this words of encouragement will bless your soul. And as I said before, if it has, please hit that subscribe button to stay tuned for future videos that we shall post. And if it and a blessing to you, would be so kind to give me a thumbs up, so it helps me in the planning of future words of uplifting encouragement for you. So until we meet again to our next video, may God smile upon you always, and may his peace rule your heart. Until we see you in the next video, God bless you.